Hello and welcome along. So yeah, I'm back. I've been ill again. You can probably hear it in my voice. I'm probably going to have to edit this quite a lot because I'm coughing fit, but I will do my best to get through the video. But as it has been a few weeks since I put my last video out, I thought I have to try and get this one out. So first, good news. Obviously, the beard is coming on pretty well, I think. I'm aiming to get it kind of down here, something like this. But we'll see how far we get with that. But going okay at the moment. So, what's today's video on? Well, it's the Shards of Magnus, because we just don't talk about Magnus enough on this channel. The first thing to say about the Shards of Magnus is there's an enormous number of them, or at least there were an enormous number of them created when Magnus was shattered. I can't obviously talk about all of them because that would be impossible, but there are some more important ones than others. So there's sort of, I don't know, 6 or 7 major Shards of Magnus. The rest are all pretty minor, inconsequential, and were relatively rapidly reabsorbed into the other shards early on in the heresy period. Well, what caused the shattering of Magnus? This is an important clarification because there is some, let's say, misinformation around that it was the physical death of Magnus on Prospero when he battled with Leman Russ that actually caused the shattering of Magnus. That's not true. Magnus was shattered long before this, and in fact, realistically, one of the reasons that the Space Wolves were able to even attack Prospero was because Magnus had already been shattered, which, along with the fact that he was very regretful of what he'd done in destroying the Emperor's work in regard to the Webway project, was also part of the reason why he kind of fell into a state of self-destruction and decided to let himself and the Thousand Sons be destroyed for the sake of the Imperium, and therefore block out any knowledge to the Thousand Sons of what was going on in the wider Imperium, and not allow them to prepare for the attack that was coming. So if that moment didn't shatter him, well, what did? It was the side effect of breaking through the Emperor's psychic barrier, protecting Terra. The Emperor is extremely powerful psychic being, had an innate ability to project a psychic shield across Terra, which protected it from warp incursions. This effect was so powerful that even by the time of the Siege of Terra, when the Emperor has been battling chaos for a considerable amount of time, and there's legions of demons like pouring into the Imperial dungeons and trying to get through the gaps created by Magnus's intrusion into the Webway project, that the Emperor is still able to hold back any of his sons who were corrupted by chaos, well, any of his sons who have become demon princes, so they just simply can't walk through this invisible barrier. And it also makes it extremely hard for demons to enter this barrier, to go through and affect people or to possess them or whatever. And so this barrier is so powerful that only Magnus is powerful enough to break it. And one, that really goes to show how incredibly powerful Magnus is, but also it's so strong that even when it does break it, it breaks him. So the energy required to break through this barrier is so much that it essentially kills him by shattering him into these shards. And it requires himself and his sons to essentially go on several quests to try and pull him back together, to get enough of him back together to stop him from dying. So what are the major Shards of Magnus? Well, the first one is often considered to be the primary Magnus. It's not really. It happens to be one of the more powerful shards that happens to be transported to the planet of the Sorcerers. So that's the one that the Thousand Sons, as far as they're concerned, is Magnus, because they've arrived on the planet of Sorcerers with this Magnus. So they just carry on considering this Magnus to be Magnus. But actually that Magnus is just one of the major Shards of Magnus. And this Magnus has access to the Thousand Sons, of course, because they're with him. And so this Magnus starts to absorb many of the minor Magnuses that are either on the planet of Sorcerers or he's able to get to through the warp. And this in itself makes him more stable and more powerful as he absorbs more and more of them, and stops him from degenerating and dying, essentially. So this is the Magnus that the Thousand Sons see as actually Magnus, and not so much the other major shards. But realistically, any one of those other shards could have been considered the primary Magnus had they started to accumulate all of the other shards to them. Now, it's said that the shards kind of represent aspects of Magnus, and in which case this shard probably represents his betrayal of the Emperor. It's hard to exactly pinpoint exactly what he's supposed to represent, because it's never really made clear in any of the books. This Magnus is the most traitory of the Shards of Magnus, because the other shards are all either neutral towards the Emperor and Chaos, or actually on the Emperor's side. So, but this shard does eventually lead the Thousand Sons into supporting the attack on Terra. But even then, it's really as an attempt to get back another shard. So even this Magnus, the most Chaos corrupted of the shards, isn't really on board with what's happening in the heresy. So what they actually represent is hard to say. Maybe it's his loyalty to the Legion, because this is the shard that actually saves the remainder of the Thousand Sons on Prospero, transfers them to the planet of sorcerers, but he doesn't really treat them very well after that point, so it doesn't really come across as loyalty. So I think, yes, probably this shard might represent Magnus's arrogance or his will to survive or something like that, which is possibly why he is the shard that gets to the planet of sorcerers as the kind of, or at least as the major shard, and why he feels it necessary to draw in all the other shards to survive and to build himself back up, etc. Whereas none of the other major shards seem to be trying to do this. So that could be what it is. That's possible. Sort of his sense of survival, or his need to carry on, or his feeling of justification of what he did, of what he's done to be at this point, that it was actually acceptable, and so on. So another major shard of Magnus is known as the Shard of Prospero. That's simply because they were remained on Prospero. So when the other shards were dissipated to various places in space and time, one remained on Prospero. At least one major shard remained. There were minor shards as well. But the major shard that remained was encountered by Jagatai Khan on Prospero when he went there to try and talk to Magnus to investigate what happened and so on, right at the beginning of the heresy, when he had no idea what was going on. And that shard really has quite a big influence on him picking, on the Khan picking the side of the Emperor. So the shard is kind of neutral. It doesn't say you should follow the Emperor or you should follow Horus, but it basically makes it clear that you should pick a side. And because the Khan is kind of, not only is he's not really so much on the fence between which one side he should pick, he's more like, well, I should just stay out of this completely because they're both wrong. This Shard of Magnus essentially convinces him to pick a side. And so once the Khan has to pick a side, he thinks, well, I'm going to have to stick with the Emperor, because he knows that this, whatever this is that Horus has got himself involved in, leads to a very bad place. And so he knows not to go down that route. So it does have a big influence on the future of the heresy, because, of course, having the Khan on the side of the Emperor is crucial in winning the heresy. Well, particularly having the Khan and the White Scars Legion, because they are incredibly effective at fighting in the early days with the heresy when most other people aren't doing much. Now, this shard is essentially destroyed or banished by the Khan because it kind of wants to be. And I think in many ways this shard represents the despair of Magnus of what has happened. That's why it's anchored to Prospero, because it's his greatest shame of the destruction of Prospero. Then there's the shard that's carried within the urn, the cremation urn of Kalista Eris, who is a remembrancer who was serving with the Thousand Sons, which is with Lemil Gorman, who is also a remembrancer who served with the Thousand Sons, who was at one time Ahriman's apprentice. So he's a relatively powerful psyker. Well, certainly would become more and more powerful as he was trained by the Thousand Sons, and it would eventually go on to be one of the early Inquisitors. Well, Kalista Eris was probably a more powerful psyker who had very powerful abilities to see the future, but wasn't able to control it very well, and actually caused herself an enormous amount of physical damage when she got these visions. Now, they were both kind of taken under the wing of the Thousand Sons and protected and helped a lot, but Kalista was, in a way, Kalista was eventually killed by the Thousand Sons, kind of accidentally, well, intentionally, but not deliberately, exactly. They weren't trying to kill her, but they did use her to try and see the future past this barrier, that psychic barrier that was stopping any knowledge of the future getting into the Thousand Sons on Prospero. And so they knowingly killed her by trying to use her power beyond her abilities to survive, essentially. But they weren't trying to kill her. They just accepted that that was a side effect of trying to see the future. And so Lemil Gorman, who was a very close friend of Kalista, held that against the Thousand Sons, and particularly Ahriman, for the rest of his life. And so that would see him turn on the Thousand Sons and become a vehement enemy of both the Thousand Sons, but particularly Ahriman himself, who had been quite a close friend of his. Now, I don't really blame the Thousand Sons for what they did here. I mean, when I remember reading the book, it was like, yeah, I hope they don't do that. And they are doing it. They just stop at some point, but they don't. They keep going until she dies. But you've got to put yourself in their position of they know that there's some impending doom about to hit Prospero, but they have no idea what it is. They can't get any context from anything. There's no way that they can see what's going on. And now they don't know that that's Magnus stopping them, because Magnus has decided he's going to accept his fate for what he's done, his accidental betrayal of the Emperor, and it's decided that they're going to have to suffer for that. Obviously, but they don't know this, so they're just thinking, well, we desperately need to see the future to determine what's going to happen, this terrible doom that's coming for us. And Kalista is on Prospero. She's going to suffer as part of this anyway. So it's a bit like, if you've got a bomb that's going to go off that's going to destroy a city, everyone in the city is going to die. Well, it's a nuclear bomb. That's why. Okay, it's a really big bomb. And you can stop it and save everyone in the city by killing one person who's already in that city. So that person's going to die anyway, and everybody dies, or that person dies and nobody else dies. Well, it's a pretty reasonable decision to kill that one person that was already going to die anyway, so that the rest of the people in the city survive. And that's essentially the situation they were in. So they justified their decision like that, and so they did what they did. And I don't think it was particularly fair of Lemuel Gorman to hold that against the Thousand Sons or Ahriman. But I understand why he's so upset, obviously, because it's his very close friend he sees killed in a terrible way. Now, Gorman, for all his now hatred of the Thousand Sons and his loyalty to the Imperium and his path that would eventually lead him to becoming an Imperial Inquisitor, or at least a Proto-Inquisitor, he actually is imprisoned by the Imperium, because the Imperium at this time is extremely suspicious of anyone who has anything to do with any of the traitor legions. So they basically arrest anyone who has any association with the Thousand Sons, and they throw him in a prison, which is like the worst prison you could possibly be in. They put him in a place called Kamiti Sona, or something like that, which is a prison run by the Silent Sisters for psychers and those suspected of any kind of sorcerous dabblings. And so he's highly suspicious because of his association with the Thousand Sons, and he's a psyker, so in he goes. And he's left there to rot for, I think, 5 years or something. Eventually, he's kind of rescued by the Thousand Sons, ironically. But, well, to be fair, they're not actually trying to rescue him. They're trying to get the Shard of Magnus, which is in this jar, but they don't know it's there. But they know some connection to him. So they try and get him so that they can get this shard. That's another story. There's a whole series of adventures that go on about trying to collect the Shards of Magnus. But the point is, there is a shard in this urn, and that shard probably represents his regret or sorrow over what the Thousand Sons was forced to become because of his actions. Now, the next shard we should talk about is the shard of something like Agaru or Goru, something like that. This is a planet where the Thousand Sons discovered a entrance into the webway. They had a battle with some sort of demon, and some of the Space Wolves were present to witness some of the goings on there, and this kind of added to the evidence against the Thousand Sons that the Space Wolves would bring at the Council of Nikaea. And so it's quite a significant place in the history of the Thousand Sons leading up to the heresy. And Magnus fights this big battle against a demon, a particularly powerful demon, which he manages to defeat pretty comfortably, because it's Magnus. But his aspect of him that represents the warrior is there for some reason. He gets attracted to this point, probably because it's a major kind of spot of conjunction between the material world and the warp, and obviously, as I said, it's significant in his history leading up to the heresy. And so this aspect of Magnus is incredibly skillful in the act of war, and in fact so much so that when a group of elite Imperial agents who consist of sort of Space Wolves, I think at least one or two Knight Errants of Malcador, powerful psychers amongst them, some other Imperial agents, and a whole sort of maniple of battlefield autonoma try to capture it, they just get mauled instantly, because the first thing it does, it just uses the power of technomancy to literally just take over the battlefield autonoma and turn them on the human and space marines troops there. So in an instant, it switches the balance of power, and then it just uses the weapons of those automata as if they was holding them itself. It's really that level of control to just wipe them out, or at least severely damage them. And it's only stopped because there happens to be a Thousand Son present with this group who has decided that what is happening is wrong, and that where the path that the Thousand Sons are taking is wrong. And you could say he betrays Magnus, and he switches sides and imprisons this Shard of Magnus inside of a human host, which greatly reduces its ability to influence the world, and it would kind of contains its power. If he hadn't been there, then they would have just been wiped out, and that would have been it, done. And these are some very powerful individuals. Now, another Shard of Magnus that has quite a significant impact on the events of the heresy is the Shard of Cadmus. Now, this is a shard that is supposed to represent Magnus's the kind of search for knowledge, and so in that sense, it's quite neutral, because it doesn't really care too much about the ethics of the heresy, you'd think, because it's just cares about finding information, about seeking ancient knowledge, essentially, trying to recover the lost knowledge. And this is a deep part of what Magnus is this search for knowledge, this deep desire to know everything. And some would argue that it's that is his downfall, his desperate need to know everything. But, however, its actions really show it to be quite ethical. It does have a sense of right and wrong, and it wants to help people that it considers to be friends and people that it thinks are doing good. This shard actually helps a crew of salamanders who are trying to escape the rune storm to take the body of Vulcan back home, which will in itself eventually lead to Vulcan's resurrection. This shard intervenes without any real need to do so. It just decides this is a good thing to do, helps them through the rune storm, which is no mean feat, because nothing else seems to be able to pass through this rune storm, but this Shard of Magnus does it like it's nothing, which then eventually leads to Vulcan's resurrection, as I said, which has a major effect on the heresy, because Vulcan has a significant effect from there, where he goes on several quests for the Emperor, recovering artifacts and so on, and then helps, basically guards the breach in the Imperial dungeons where the Webway project was damaged by Magnus's original incursion. And so in many ways, it's kind of making up for what he's done in damaging the Webway project. Now, this shard will eventually go back to Terra. In fact, Terra in the past, because it is able to travel through time as well as space, and is essentially in the various underground ruins of Terra, where it spends its time trying to seek out knowledge, not doing much other than that, and is recovered by Ahriman. Now, on one of Ahriman's various missions to kind of reassemble Magnus, he does come across another quite significant Shard of Magnus, which is the Shard of Nikaea. Now, this makes a lot of sense that there be a Shard of Magnus here, because, again, it's a very significant place in his story. Obviously, the Council of Nikaea is where he is kind of betrayed by so many he thought were his friends, or at least people he could rely on within the Imperium, who turn on him and essentially tell him that he can't be who he is. He can't use his psychic abilities anymore, and they ban the use of psychic abilities within the legions without him having any clue that this was going to happen. So he's invited to this place to sort of talk on behalf of why psychic powers are useful within the military context of the legions, and there's suddenly ambushed by people giving evidence against him, and really instills in Magnus this deep feeling of betrayal. And so this shard is supposed to represent that feeling of betrayal, both by some of his brothers and particularly by the Emperor, and particularly members of the Space Walls who had served with them temporarily and had essentially been observing them to take notes and be able to hand in at this council, so they could say, look, they're doing all these bad things, look, this is when they did this is when they did this. And so it obviously leaves a deep feeling of bitterness towards the Space Walls for what they've done, but also other people who he thought he could rely on, who didn't actually stand up, counter their arguments. And this shard would eventually be recovered by Ahriman as well, and reunited with the shard on the planet of the Sorcerers. With this shard and the previous two I mentioned brought back to the planet of the Sorcerers and reunited with the shard there, that becomes kind of almost all Magnus. But there's still a significant bit missing. That is the shard that's sometimes known as the Shard of Terror. Now, this is the shard that was left behind when Magnus was shattered originally on Terra, as he broke through the Emperor's psychic barrier, protecting the inner workings of the Webway project. And this shard is considered to be Magnus's sort of nobility, and all of the aspects of his loyalty to the Emperor and his desire to do good things. But that's not really fair, because, as I said, many of the other shards are quite happy to do good things, actually want to do good things, are not in any way evil or in lacking in morals or ethics, whatever. So it may be that this shard represents loyalty to the Emperor. That's probably plausible, but I don't think it represents everything that's good in Magnus. That can't really be true. So this shard, of course, relatively famously, especially if you've watched my videos, is merged with a member of the Thousand Sons by Malcador to create Janus, who would eventually be the first Grand Master of the Grey Knights. Now, Malcador doesn't actually intend to do that. He just does it accidentally. He's trying to create a version of Magnus that he can control and put on the Golden Throne so that the Emperor doesn't have to sit on it, because that's Magnus's original intended purpose. That's very strongly implied. Well, it's not even implied. It's outright stated a couple of times within the Horus Heresy books that Magnus's purpose was to sit on the Golden Throne. Now, because he's lost Magnus to treachery, Malcador can't use him, but he thinks, oh, I've got this Shard of Magnus. It's still very powerful. I could use that, and I just need to have some way of controlling it. So he thinks binding it into the body of this Thousand Son, who he thinks it will be easier to do because he's a Thousand Son, therefore I'll carry the gene seed of Magnus. I think that's his reasoning. He thinks he'll get that version of Magnus out of him that he could use to take the Emperor off the Golden Throne. But that doesn't work, of course. But instead you get this new being, Janus, or Janus, as it's actually known, and then slowly over time the name becomes Janus, who will become one of his knight errants, and eventually, because they're by far the most powerful, because they've got the Shard of Magnus within them, will become the Grand Master of the Grey Knights when he founds them. Because the knight errants who would become the leadership of this new unit, the Grey Knights, are sent to Titan and then sort of shielded, put into the kind of a warp bubble by Malcador. They're essentially out of reach of anyone for, I think it's a ridiculous amount of time, maybe 1,000 years or something, while they build up the Legion. And that means that Magnus can't recover this last shard of him, which he puts a lot of effort into, because essentially the only reason he gets involved in the Siege of Terra is because he wants to get this shard back. So basically right up to that point, when the heresy has run its course to the point where the Siege of Terra is about to happen, that Magnus decides, well, I'm going to throw my lot in with the traitors and go to the Siege of Terra. He hasn't helped them up to this point in any way. Occasionally he speaks to one or two of them, but he doesn't really help them. And he gets to this point, and he's like, well, I've got to get my last shard back, at least my last major shard back. So I need to go to Terra. The only way I'm going to get there is to throw my lot in with the traitors and help them. So that's it. So he allows Ahriman and a few of the other Thousand Sons to aid the traitors in getting their fleet in deep into the Sol system, where normally you wouldn't be able to come out of the warp into that deep into a system. So they use their sorcerer's abilities to create a big rift very quite close to Terra, which allows the massive fleet to emerge so deep in that it's bypassed a lot of the defenses of Terra. It also reduces the time required, because normally you have to translate out the warp outside of a system, and then you can slowly make your way in at sublight speeds into the center, and then so that would have taken a lot longer as well, and allowed more time for the loyalist forces to prepare themselves for the attack. This does greatly aid the traitors in their attempt to conquer Terra, but it's only done because Magnus wants to get his shard back. Now, these are all the major shards that were mentioned during the heresy period in the Horus Heresy books. There are two other shards that gain names, if you like. They don't really have personal names. They're just names sort of given to them because of objects they're associated with, or places they're associated with, or something like that. And that is the shard of the Athenaeum of Callimachus. So Callimachus is the scribe of Magnus, the personal scribe of Magnus. He was responsible for writing down all of Magnus's thoughts and so on. And he creates this massive library on behalf of the Inquisition after the heresy. It recreates a lot of the knowledge of Magnus. So there's the famous book of Magnus, where Magnus has written down all of his knowledge of the warp. Callimachus creates this library to contain the knowledge that he has from working as Magnus' scribe. There is a shard of Magnus that becomes associated with this library, and is supposed to be the shard that represents sort of manipulation and secrets, etc., and has an influence over Ahriman. But that doesn't happen until long after the heresy. And then another one that is part of this same story is the Vengeance of Magnus, which is a shard of Magnus that's supposed to represent his anger, at least, and his need for vengeance of what happened to him and his legion. And that is a shard that gets attached to a Space Marine librarian of some point in the future, again, long after the heresy, but these then becoming a Chaos Sorcerer, and eventually a major rival to Ahriman. And at least this one does represent a considerable amount of power when infused with the power of this shard. This now Chaos Sorcerer goes on a massive rampage on the Inquisition's flagship and does a huge amount of damage to people that are dedicated to fighting psychic beings. Obviously a very powerful shard. And so it's fair to say that even the Magnus that is at the end of the heresy and exists in the 40k universe, is not the complete Magnus, the Magnus that existed pre-heresy. He's still missing major parts of him who were very significantly powerful parts of him. So these two shards being the obvious ones, but also the shard that created Janus. What happened to that shard is unknown. It could still exist. It's unlikely that it simply disappeared. So what happened to that shard? That's probably a story in itself. Where did the shard of Magnus that became Janus go? Does it still exist within the 40k universe? Is it actually one of the characters of the 40k universe? That'd be maybe an interesting video to do at some point. So there you go. They are the major shards of Magnus and some of the important events that surround them. Just to wrap up, the major takeaway from this is that Magnus is never the full Magnus in any of the Horus Heresy stories. Once he's tried to warn the Emperor, that's no longer the true Magnus. After that point, there is this broken Magnus and his many shards who are trying to do various different things based on their own specific personality traits that come from aspects of him they represent. All the way up to the present 40k universe, that isn't the full Magnus. That's just a significant part of Magnus. My final kind of reflection on the stories of Magnus and his shards would be just how incredibly powerful Magnus is as a being. Like, these individual shards all did incredibly powerful things, which any of the other Primarchs would be proud of as an individual being able to achieve. And the real Magnus, with all of this put back together as one being, really is underestimated as a Primarch, just how powerful he is, and really is the only being that has in any way any level of power that comparable to the Emperor himself. And often you'll find throughout the Heresy books, the other Primarchs or other leading characters will say things like, no one could achieve this or no one could do that except for Magnus, maybe. That's what it was always. Oh, except for, well, maybe Magnus could. He is the only one that really can realistically be compared to the Emperor in terms of pure power. Thanks for watching. Next time, I think it'll be Lorgar, which is the early life of Lorgar before he was recovered by the Emperor. And I am still working in the background on a video about the Emperor himself and what he was doing during the Golden Age of technology and the Dark Ages of technology and the lead up to the Unification Wars and all the other weird stuff he was getting up to. But it's just an incredibly hard video to make because it's so hard to find any information on it. So one day that will come out. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you next time.